In Band of Brothers, there is a memorable encounter between Dick Winters and Herbert Sobel in the final episode of the series, titled Points. Easy Company is in Austria, and Dick Winters pulls up in a jeep as a German general is surrendering. The general asks Carwood Lipton if he can first address his men. Major Winters then sees Captain Sobel walking by with another soldier, who sees Major Winters and salutes him. Sobel turns his head and attempts to avoid saluting Winters, who calls to Sobel, "Captain Sobel, we salute the rank, not the man." Sobel then faces Major Winters and salutes him before moving on. Winters turns and looks at his friend Lewis Nixon, who is sitting next to him in the jeep. Nixon shakes his head slightly from side to side, smirking, acknowledging that the moment was obviously more about payback rather than honoring military code. You might be surprised to learn that this encounter did happen in real life. However, it didn't unfold as Band of Brothers portrays it. First, the actual encounter happened during the war, when Dick Winters and the battalion were stationed in Montmellon-le-Grand, France, from February 25th to April 2nd, 1945. It happened shortly after Winters had been promoted to major. In Cole C. Kingseed's book, Conversations with Major Dick Winters, Winters acknowledges that the series altered the timing of the real-life encounter. Sobel just disappeared, Winters said of Sobel's transfer out of Easy Company prior to D-Day. This was after the NCOs attempted a mutiny to get rid of him so that they wouldn't have to go into battle under his command. Shortly before that, Sobel had tried to court-martial Winters over a latrine inspection. In Kingseed's book, Winters then notes the next time that he saw Sobel and how it was altered in Band of Brothers. "I later saw him at Montmellon, later in the war. An event featured in the miniseries, but the timing was off," said Winters. With regard to the actual encounter, Dick Winters was not sitting in a jeep when he saw Sobel. Rather, he was walking down the street in Montmellon when he saw Captain Sobel approaching in the opposite direction. After noticing Winters, Sobel dropped his head and walked by without saluting. It was then that, according to author Stephen Ambrose, Winters called out, "Captain Sobel, we salute the rank, not the man." Sobel stopped and faced Winters. "Yes, sir," he responded as he snapped off a salute. Ambrose, who had interviewed Winters extensively, stated that the exchange was one of the most satisfying moments in Winters' life. Dick Winters described the encounter in almost the same way in his 2006 memoir, Beyond Band of Brothers, with a slight variation on what was said during the exchange. Winters stated that after Sobel passed him on the street in Montmellon without recognition, he stopped, turned, and said, "Captain, we recognize and honor the rank." Sobel then stopped, turned, came to attention, and said, "Yes, sir." The two men exchanged salutes, and Sobel moved on. Winters noted, "My revenge was sweet. Sobel's debt to me had been paid in full." Another difference in the series is that due to Band of Brothers fictionalizing the moment as happening after the war in Europe has ended, the series changes who witnessed the exchange. I found no mention of Lewis Nixon being with Winters like we see in the series, or Joseph Liebgott. According to author Stephen Ambrose, David Kenyon Webster and John Martin were standing nearby and observed the encounter, with Martin responding, "I like to see officers pull rank on each other." However, in his memoir, Winters implies there were no witnesses, stating that it happened while he was walking down a deserted company street in Montmellon. Now, it's worth pointing out that these are not the only sources that describe this encounter between Winters and Sobel, and other sources describe it differently from Winters' memoir. In Larry Alexander's 2005 Dick Winters biography, Biggest Brother, he describes the exchange in a similar manner to Winters, but he states that it happened after VE Day in August 1945, while Winters was stationed at a camp in the French village of Joigny, about 80 miles southeast of Paris. The author, Alexander, was a journalist and Winters' neighbor and had interviewed Winters for the book. It's unclear why he has this event happening at an entirely different time and location. The most wildly different version of the Winters-Sobel encounter is found in the 2008 memoir of Tech Sergeant Don Malarkey, titled Easy Company Soldier, which he wrote with co-writer Bob Welch. In the book, Malarkey indicates that he was the only Easy Company member present for the encounter between Winters and Sobel, and that it happened after the war was over, when Winters was driving him in the command car to drop him off at the airport in Salzburg, Austria. On the way, they stopped at Division Supply for gas. Sobel, who was then a supply officer for Regiment, came out and approached them. At first, Sobel didn't notice Winters, but Winters had clearly recognized him. "Don't you salute a superior officer?" Winters asked. Sobel saw him and froze. "You're not saluting the man, you're saluting the rank," said Winters. According to Malarkey, Sobel whipped the fastest salute he's ever seen. Winters nodded at Sobel as the two exchanged a hint of respect before Winters pulled away. We can only speculate as to why Don Malarkey's description of the Winters-Sobel encounter in his book deviates so much from the others, including how Winters himself described it. In the least, it's interesting and at the same time a bit frustrating to have so many versions of a single event, including the fictionalized version presented in the series. In the end, the changes that Band of Brothers makes to the Winters-Sobel encounter, particularly in relation to Winters' memoir, are largely forgivable and perhaps even make sense in terms of condensing the story into a 10-episode series. However, other deviations from historical accuracy in the series, such as the depiction of Albert Blythe, are harder to forgive. If you want to learn more about Dick Winters and Herbert Sobel, including what Band of Brothers gets right and wrong, check out the videos linked on the screen. If you enjoyed this video and want to follow all of our latest Band of Brothers content, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Anchors away, my friends.